Hi, it's Melissa Doyle for World Vision. Christmas is the perfect time to give kindness to a child in need. Each child I've sponsored with World Vision holds a special place in my heart. I'll never forget meeting 4-year-old Bridget in Kenya. Her mum just wanted to send her to school. That dream came true thanks to sponsorship. This Christmas, you too can help a child gain hope and essentials like food, clean water and education. Search World Vision and sponsor a child today.
Ever had those moments where very quickly you realised you're not the smartest person in the room? You're not the wisest person in the room. You're certainly not the one who's given the most thought to this topic in the room. But at the same time, you're like, boy, that person over there I love listening to them. Well, that description is going to fall very poorly on our next guest's ears, at least. He would be pushing it back because he's a very humble man, but it's very, very true of him. Mark Sayers has been commentating on our culture and how Christian spirituality, a life following Jesus, fits into that for decades now. He leads a church called Red Church as well, and it's a real privilege to sit down with him and talk about these things. What's happening in our culture today, in our world? Where is Christian faith and people wanting to follow Jesus bubbling up to remarkable levels? What does it mean to live a life of faith? To live an understanding of working through a Christian faith perspective in our current culture. We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more with Mark today. Do please like, rate, review, follow the program, share it with friends. It helps us get this out to more and more people. Let's chat with Mark Sayers. G'day, Mark.
Oh, it's great to be back.
It's good to have you in the studio once again. Of course, you're an author, you're a pastor, you're a thought leader. You travel the world having conversations with people about culture as well. And it seems like it's one of those moments that's always been a passion for you. Where is that sort of ability to stand back and look and think? Was that always something when you were a kid you were doing that, or was that something later in life?
Yeah, I always had a big picture view of the world. My family would sit around the table and chat, and bigger family discussions were always just part of it. So I feel like I'm continuing that. I studied advertising after I left high school, which also is another way of looking at culture, understanding demographics and stuff like that. And yeah, it's always been there, a passion. And I think as culture's gotten more accelerated and crazy, it's like more and more people want to have someone help them understand what's going on. So yeah.
Yeah. The question I always ask around that, is, you've said as sort of, culture sort of accelerated, these sorts of things have happened, technology's done that. We are living in a world that's very different, post sort of the iPhone moment or social media, people can choose different moments with that. Are we on the big span of history actually living in a whole brand new space? Or is it just that because we're living through it, we feel like that? There's been sort of these revolutions of thought and idea. Or is this actually something different?
I think what's unique about this moment is there's multiple changes happening simultaneously. So you can live for decades. I can't remember, it was Lennon or someone said, there's decades where nothing happens and then years where decades happens. And, we're in that. Often there'll be a social change, a technological change, a political change, a world change, but we're seeing all of them happening at once. Yeah, right. The world order's changing, politics is changing, AI, digital's changing culture, social sort of trends are changing, and it's all happening at the same time.
Yeah. From your perspective, and certainly what you've been involved in for many, many years, as you lead churches, as you write books, as you speak, has been from that faith perspective. Tell us a little of your journey of coming to say, well, I really believe this Jesus guy is God and that he rose from the dead and that it's worth following him. Tell us a bit of that story.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian family, and my father had come to faith from a non-faith background, and so I was raised in that environment, but I think it really came as part of my life, and I really made this commitment to be 100% fair income in on this. And that was really probably when I was like 16, 17. I got to a bit of a crisis in my life. I had a mental health crisis, which I learned later on. That's what it was. And, I sort of came to the end of myself. And that's really the beginning of following Jesus with all my heart began. And, so it was, as I said, studied advertising after high school. But I also did this trip overseas with a missions organization to work in a sort of gang-affected area in California. And just when I was there, like, God really just sort of, in a sense, humbled me. And I was exposed to a world of, deep need and suffering. And that's when I decided I wanted to go into ministry. And yes, I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah. So has it been ministry in church life sort of ever since then? Or was there different sort of forms of that?
So I've always done sort of church stuff. I worked with the Salvation Army for over 10 years. So there was different things of helping people who are in, experiencing homelessness or different things like that. But I've also always had this other thing going on, which is writing about culture, thinking about, how society can be renewed. So there's always been those two tracks in my life, church and then culture.
Yeah. Can we deep dive a little bit on the church focus first? And then I want to come and talk a bit more culture, but you can't untangle these within your world, I understand, because part of your heart for now with Red Church and with church you've worked in is actually to try and truly make sure that they are joined together, right?
Yes.
You're actually trying to say, look, that we're not trying to pretend that church is a place where you just come and escape, and that's the whole purpose, is to escape. You've always had this idea to bring those together. How have you actually approached church differently as you've led and been in leadership?
Well, I think you always got to be aware of the conditions that people are living in. People don't just turn up to church and sort of press pause button on their life, their culture, their worldview. They come into church and they bring all those things. And also there's a variety of those things in church now. We live in a very multicultural, diverse society. So when people come into church, there's an element where almost we're a bit like missionaries, and in the past when, missions would happen and people would go to another culture, they'd have to ask the question, what's of my culture? What am I bringing? What's their culture? And then what's the transferable parts of the gospel or the kingdom of God? So I think I brought that focus to my own culture because I realized my own culture was changing. So we're always trying to ask the question, what does it look like to live for Jesus fully in this cultural moment, in the time that we're living in?
Yeah. Evangelical churches, I suppose, as a whole over the last decades and decades has been almost single-minded in the focus is how do we make somebody get to a point where they accept Jesus, right? And then there's other sort of things that then work around that. Is that how you approach the living and the life of what your church is about?
I mean, there's always the high point of someone coming to a faith in Jesus, which, leads to them, entering into right relationship with him. That's always central, but I think also that Jesus doesn't, just sort of stop there. There's us being made right with Jesus, but then that's also becoming more like Jesus. Jesus' answer for the world is how do we become more like him? So someone who decides to follow Jesus with all their life, that then has implications for their relationships, how they interact with society, their job, their vocation, their health, the world. It's this sense where Jesus' plan is to move history towards his ends, and us becoming more like him in all the spheres of our life is also part of that plan.
Yeah. One thing that, even if you head to the website and read a little bit about you, Mark, and I was fascinated by this line, was around that you're passionate about deep discipleship, resilient leadership, and renewal in the church and society. And from everything I know of you, I was like, wow, that sounds exactly like Mark to me from it. Can we maybe deep dive on each of those and, pull out examples as you go from that? Let's talk about deep discipleship versus discipleship in that sense. I know you've got a real heart around sort of more spiritual formation and what that means, and perhaps our church life, especially in Australia and New Zealand, has been a little bit more performance-based. You go, you watch something, you hear it, you go away, you might even be in a group, but we sort of study the Bible rather than let it study us, as it were. What do you mean by deep discipleship, and what are the things you think the church at large really needs to grab a hold of?
Yeah. I mean, Jesus calls us to fully follow him with all of our lives. You see the journey of the disciples is this process of them realizing that more and more. A lot of the sort of, moments where the disciples almost seem a bit foolish is really them putting down their expectations of what they expected was going to happen. And in the same way, when we follow Jesus, it's like this ever deepening, and there's a very sort of religious-y term, which I think is still a good one, understanding the lordship of Jesus actually means we're to put everything before him. And as we do that, that transforms. I think there's a danger, and look, as a pastor, I totally get it, that that's always not popular. Sometimes you can get a larger crowd, not necessarily challenging people to deeper discipleship. I heard this really challenging sort of line from the American pastor, Francis Chan, and he said, "My concern was that if Jesus planted a church in my neighborhood, my church might be bigger than his." I just thought, wow, okay, wow.
Yeah,
and I think,
wow.
there's always been, sort of cultural forms of Christianity where you're a Christian because your grandmother was, or you're Christian because your great auntie was a Lutheran, or perhaps you're from that national group or ethnic group, or even just a sort of, I think in Australia and New Zealand you often see this sort of culture of Christianity that's around comfort. So we want to go to the service, but there's a footy game on in the afternoon, we want it to finish on time, or we don't want it to interfere with our everyday lives. So for me, deep discipleship is the question of what would it look like if Jesus fully transformed us.
What are the things, if there are specifics, that you go, well, here's Mark with the magic wand over the church in Australia and New Zealand, deep discipleship. These are the 2 or 3 things I'd be saying, hey, I think these are the things we should at least start with on an individual basis or even on a community basis.
Yeah. I think one is, are we building churches and building discipleship around the fact that God is present and working in the world? Are we just coming to sort of get a high sort of event, moment, which can happen, and sometimes there's good in that, or actually we're realizing that God's at work in the world, he's drawing people to him. So how do we align ourselves with what God is doing in the church, but also outside the church? I think also, again too, unintentionally, unconsciously, we can be shaped by cultural scripts that are out there. But what if we were more shaped by actually Scripture and the what Scripture is teaching us? And I think as well, there's often these sort of compromises that we make to sort of have one foot in the world, one foot in the kingdom of God. And often we think of the more extreme versions of those, like it could be sort of patterns that are not really healthy that we know are wrong. But also sometimes it can just be these little compromises, again, of comfort. We want a comfortable, digestible faith. But again, what would it look like if the church centered itself around a gutsy discipleship and invited people into that?
Yeah. Where does sort of the daily habits, the posture, there's a lot of work around, practicing the way John Mark Comer's, I know you know John, and there's a bit of a movement of people understanding sort of this actually a rule of life, a way of saying, well, I'm going to make this the priority of that. How important do you think those sorts of things are?
I remember realizing and coming to the realization that my day was not set by me. There's an element where traditionally people have had to get work on time, get to school on time, kids may wake you up, whatever. But then increasingly you look at today, a lot of people wake up, the first thing they do is look at their phone. That the amount we look at our phone is just an incredible amount when you look at that little thing on your iPhone that tells how many hours a day. And often too that sets, and again, having studied advertising, I began to realize it's like advertising when I studied it was a lot more sort of simple, but now it's almost like it has a nuclear power behind it in that our attention set to things. So our days are not set by ourselves. So I think there's a lot of Christians realizing that actually we need to almost be a bit countercultural and set the pattern of our day according to things that Christians have done throughout history, which actually move us to be more like Jesus. There's a danger in that. We can get a bit religious and like, I didn't do this exactly right. We've got to be careful about that. But I think being proactive and intentional in setting the things you want to do, like, I begin every day reading the scriptures, praying. Some days it's like amazing. Other days it's just, I'm sort of reading and the kids are interrupting me. And but it's that practice of doing it. It shapes that my first intention of the day is actually to set myself before Scripture, encounter Jesus and pray for my day. That's just a small example.
Yeah. You've written a book, Platforms to Pillars. Is this sort of the concept or parts of that concept around that?
Yeah. So what I sort of set out in that book was I began to realize that, in the past, not far from here, there was, I saw this picture from the 1950s or 60s, and it was like a town fair thing, and there was all these floats going down the main road, and there are all these different institutions. The Country Women's, even it's not even the country, but Country Women's Association, and all these different groups. And in the past, people were shaped by institutions. That's what really gave us their values. But now, increasingly, they're shaped by digital platforms, and they give us a sort of platform where it's like. Platform's actually the origins of that term, because I was like, you hear that everywhere, digital platforms. So I searched it and I looked back to the origins of that term. It really goes back to kings used to be put on a platform which said they're better than everyone else. But now digital culture offers almost everyone a king or queen-like existence. So that sort of says, like, you can set your day how you want it, but in reality, others are setting for us. So in that book, I was asking the question of how do we not live like that? And in Scripture, you see in Revelation, in the Bible, the last book of the Bible, this image of humans as pillars. That God's actually building this temple in the world, and humans are pillars. A pillar often is a word used when someone passes away who's deeply invested in their community. They're a pillar of the community, and there's a biblical idea behind that. So that's the idea behind that book.
Yeah. We're going to be back with Mark Sayers in a couple of minutes' time. We're going to keep exploring more of these things that he's passionate about. He's studied so much about. He's written so many books about as well. Especially going to touch off on around resilient leadership and also renewal in church and society. And I know Mark's even literally just had some experience over in Europe around some renewal and society and church mixing in ways that perhaps we haven't seen for a long, long time. That's on the way next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielen. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
One of the things you are very passionate about is also this sort of idea of leadership, but sort of resilient leadership as well. We had a chat with Rick Warren a little earlier on, and part of the work he's doing, finishing the task, about sharing the gospel really around the world and getting it to everybody by 2033. And one of his sort of key aims was around this idea of leadership as well. Why, from your perspective, is this such an important thing to be focusing on?
Yeah. I think there's two sort of key changes that have happened in the world. If you think about how leadership was exercised for many decades up until recently, someone might get to the top of an organisation, someone might be on radio, someone might be printing a newspaper or a prime minister. And to actually, what that gave them the ability to was to communicate to lots of people. To get to a letter or feedback to the Prime Minister was actually quite hard. Even the head of an organisation might have secretaries or assistants where you had to sort of gatekeep and get through them. So it gave people a broad way of communicating, but the feedback loop wasn't as strong. Now, sometimes that meant people were quite sort of, in their little ivory towers and in a bubble from the world. But what digital media has done is enabled the feedback loops to be really quick and low cost. If I wanted to talk to the Prime Minister, that would have a lot of, like hoops I'd have to jump through. But now if the Prime Minister puts something up on X or Instagram, I can instantly reply, and there's little cost to that. So what that meant is a lot of leaders, all of a sudden, which had been sort of like, protected from feedback, all of a sudden experience feedback. There's a positive sense to feedback. So there's a great element to that. This is actually what people are thinking. That's helpful. But also, we live in a broken world, which sometimes is really tough. So what you've seen leaders have to now deal with a lot more of feedback. Instead of someone booking to have a coffee with someone to give them their feedback and having to sit face to face, we can fire off, critique a lot easier. And speaking of leaders all across the world in different fields and in churches, in business, marketplace, politics, this takes a toll. It really is difficult, and some of it gets really nasty. So to be a leader now, there has to be an emotional resilience that we didn't have before. The second thing is that a lot of younger leaders have been raised in a world where the other side of this is we've also been quite protected from difficulty. There's been styles of parenting where we see the way to help someone flourish is to protect them from the tougher side of life. We move from a culture where only the winner got a ribbon to everyone gets a ribbon. Yes. I remember my kids were playing, I went with my kids to a party when they were younger, and someone doing pass the parcel, and I was shocked that it stopped. There was like a toy at every layer of paper.
Right.
When I was a kid, there was only one toy, and you either got it or you didn't. So you've also got a younger generation of leaders who all of a sudden are moving into leadership, and they have a great heart and they want to achieve things, but the cost is really tough. So leadership is hard and difficult, but we need good leaders in the world. So any leader now, to make that decision, needs to learn to develop emotional resiliency, which I think has always been part of leadership.
Yes.
So I think this, if anything of importance is going to get done in the world, we need leaders who are resilient to make that happen.
Yeah. Is there sort of acknowledging that that's a next generation coming who perhaps hasn't had that natural resilient upbringing? Is there a magic bullet's the wrong word, but is there something you go, actually, I reckon this is the thing that actually is going to help this resiliency?
Yeah, I think I'd simply boil it down to this: without difficulty, you don't grow. And you can get information. You can look at a YouTube video, and that will give you information. But the scriptures differentiate between really sort of information and wisdom. Wisdom's like this timeless, often God-given sense of knowledge that really helps you learn to be an effective person, a flourishing person, and a flourishing leader. So what I've learned is I've learned lots of stuff, but I've deeply grown as a person in the toughest periods. I wish it was another way.
Yeah.
So I think helping people see that not to run from difficulty, to actually walk through it, is actually something which grows us.
Yeah, and it's a bit foreign at the moment, especially in our Western culture, for sure. You've written a book, The Disappearing Church, The Reappearing Church. I think it's Reappearing Church is what it's called. Renewal in church and society is a big part of it. You've just experienced it, I know, even over in Europe, you've seen some things. What are you seeing at the moment in this sort of space around what church is, maybe what church is going to become, and how church and society are working together? Yeah, in 2019, I wrote this book called Reappearing Church. I'd written an earlier book about really how secularism was just growing in the world. And then with Reappearing Church, I sort of felt the call to write a book about, what if we dared to ask, because everyone was sort of just assuming the future of the church is decline, even a lot of pastors and leaders were, but what if actually secularism is going to sort of weaken itself? It couldn't deliver this utopia that it was promising at a world level, at a society level, at an individual level. And what if all of a sudden people are going to start to lose faith in secularism? And what if this led to a sort of renewal of the church? I was reading, this is 2019, I'd read a book, A History of the Spanish Flu. My grandfather, after World War I remember hearing these stories that he, as a young man, had gotten the Spanish flu. Him and his father almost died. They were at this hospital ward. I remember thinking, imagine if there was a global flu, how would it change the world? So this is before COVID,
this is 2019.
You're reading this. Oh,
I wrote this, and in the book I said, if we had another Spanish flu epidemic where, across the world, millions, were affected by it, how would things change? Now, I'm not claiming that I had a magic insight it was coming, but it was more a sort of thought experiment. Yeah. And I think what you do see is that often comfort, security, when they're in societies, that means their society is often secular, because we don't realize, we think we can live without God. All of a sudden, when difficulty comes, crisis comes, people become much more religiously open. And you look at 2020, with COVID, but then COVID led to economic insecurity. There was a war in Ukraine, and there's all kinds of stuff, cost of living. You're seeing the script start to change. So I was recently in Europe, and there's a fascinating turnaround happening with secularism, where in countries that were considered secular, we're going to get more and more secular. I was in Scandinavia, in places like Germany, and you've seen this in the Netherlands, in Great Britain. You're seeing particularly the young have a real resurgence in interest in religion. Like in Finland, young people, Gen Z, their belief in God has doubled in the last sort of 18 months.
Wow.
So you're seeing this fascinating turnaround. Similar things, Bible sales going up. Secularism in the USA seems to have turned around. In Britain, I think it's the amount, the Bible Society did a report recently, the amount of Gen Z going to church has quadrupled in the last couple of years. And I think this is that theory playing out. People are seeing that secularism now looks wobbly and not working, so they're looking for bigger answers.
Do you think that the reason that it's perhaps not working internally? Is it sort of on a mass scale of, hey, secularism isn't providing that for me? Or is it more a sense that, well, internally there's something in me that, we would call perhaps the part, the God part in somebody, the Bible talks about sort of everyone searching for eternity sort of inside themselves, that can't be replaced by this. Like, is it sort of the grand scale of the big society not delivering, or is it sort of an internal thing that's pushing people to that?
I think it's both. And I think what's happening is, number one, Western society didn't just, it promised people you're going to have this amazing lifestyle. You're going to be able to travel. You'll be able to buy property. You'll be able to do this. You'll be able to have what you want at the click of a button. And the world will get more and more. You go back to, you think about the Obama period or something like this. Like the world, yes, we can. Yes. The world's going to be in this amazing place. So people seeing that falling over, they start to look elsewhere. And perhaps when things get a bit quieter, you start to, listen in different ways. What struck me in Europe was the amount of stories I heard of people having dreams, where all of a sudden God reveals himself in a dream. I heard the story of one young woman who just, in desperation from some of that stuff we talked about in the world, sitting in a lounge room and just saying, universe, reveal yourself. And then she has this vision of Jesus, and then rocks up to the local church saying, hi, I've just become a Christian. And they're like, did someone lead you to Jesus? She's like, I don't know any Christians. I heard variants of that story again and again. Yeah. I heard multiple stories of people just typing into ChatGPT their existential questions, and ChatGPT saying, there's a church a mile around the corner. And then people turning up at church, like, who brought you here? ChatGPT. Wow. So I think that there is that capacity in humans to, like a God-shaped hole is how often it's been described. And so I think it's those two things in concert working together.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's often those stories of a dream, and especially Jesus being seen in a dream or a vision, have come out of places like Iran for many decades, right? Where there's no opportunity in the culture for Jesus to be heard, and yet here you are within European culture, where maybe that's through that secularism is not being heard as well, and so it is coming in that way as well. Yeah. And
my friend David Gegnatsa, who's head of Elam Ministries, which is a big global ministry to Iranian and Persian people and part of the diaspora, has told these stories for years, amazing stories of people having dreams and visions. I remember meeting a young person coming to Australia, had a vision of Jesus on a boat at sea, and he just made the comment recently that, to his complete surprise, this is now happening in the secular West. So 100% spot on.
Yeah, it's remarkable. As we sort of head into the next sphere of whatever the world is, here we are, we're 4 or 5 years sort of beyond that COVID idea. Maybe secularism is not working as well as everyone thought, and this is happening. Do you have any prediction? Is perhaps the wrong word, but thoughts around where are we heading, and especially really with a mindset of sort of the church at large, individuals who have a faith belief. How should they be posturing themselves, I suppose, into this next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of 3 big precarious things, or you could say 4. You could do many. We've got environmental challenges. The economy is fragile. But the sort of 2 big ones is, I think we're increasingly moving into a world which conflict could become more normal. But then the big one is, I think, the rise of artificial intelligence. How this is going to push our ideas of what is a human, the melding of technology and humans. I predict in 3-4 years it'll be normal to go down the shops and see a robot walking by, to go into a nursing home and see perhaps a loved one cared for by a robot. To see more and more people talking to digital assistants as normal. And this is going to, I think, rock us at a profound level. So I think the trend is only going to continue. I don't see the prediction of, look, this is a bit of a bumpy period. In 4 years, everything's going to go back to what it looked like in 2011. It's not going to happen. It could, but it's highly unlikely. So I think that what we need to do, what I noticed in Europe, it was really interesting. People were asking the question, is this a revival? And my sort of reflection after a little while thinking about it is, I don't think it is. A revival often is when the church gets revived and then people are drawn to it. This is something profound happening in the culture, and there is an openness to God, an openness to faith, an openness to Jesus. So my encouragement to people, and I'm encouraging my church this, hey, maybe in 2011, if you shared your faith in your lunchroom at work, people would think you're weird. And maybe if there's 10 people, 4 will still think you're weird, but maybe 5 might actually go, hey, yeah, I believe this, or hey, yeah, I'm interested in coming to church. Heard lots of stories recently. People have been talking to a friend or a loved one about faith for some time, and they've been resistant. And then in the last 18 months, they're all of a sudden like, yeah, I want to come to that alpha group. I'd love to visit church. Let's read the Bible together. So I would just say to people, Christians can be shaped, other people can be shaped by the idea of secularism, where we think that, yeah, we're this sort of dying breed, but there is more opportunity out there than we realise.
Yeah. I think this idea of how we are, who we are as humans, as spiritual beings in that AI sort of progression is going to be big questions as well. And I think that's important to have others around to have that conversation in community. Final question as we sort of, we could keep going on for days, Mark, but the concept that has been getting stronger and stronger and stronger around this idea that we are sort of pulling further to the right and left, right? Whether it could be called tribalism, whatever it might be, seems to be happening at times in church as well, where it's well, I'm this, and so therefore I'll accept, as long as the person that I'm following is mostly on these things, whatever else they say, I'm fine with it. Trump's an example of that, perhaps, for those on the right and the left, as they tussle with that, with the faith belief in the US. Is that something that you think, in light of all we talked about, AI, a breakdown perhaps of secularism concept, is going to continue, or, and social media's helped that, of course, further distanced you away from each other. It's a lot easier to have a crack at somebody. Do you think that's going to continue, or is that actually maybe going to break down a little bit more?
Yeah, so two things. It's interesting from an Australian-New Zealand perspective how the statistics actually say it's quite different here. So Pew, who one of the world's most leading demographers, actually did a survey recently on this tribalisation, polarisation around the world. Basically, by their scale, Australia is basically not polarised. There's a number of reasons for that. New Zealand is a bit more, but our two countries, compared to a lot of the world, isn't as polarised as the US. Now, the US drives, and Europe is becoming polarised. The US is polarised. So I just put that sort of caveat at the beginning. So sometimes our social media space is, or if you jump on...
because it's a part of all of that whole minutia.
Jump on X, say, you're seeing it all there because you don't have an Australia-only, social media platform. But what's interesting is I think it's starting to break down. I think that the world is getting more and more complex. You look at the issue of Israel-Palestine, you're seeing the right begin to shatter and fragment on it. You're seeing elements of the left starting to shatter and fragment on it. AI is going to be another one. What's the left-right version of AI? If this is going to become the dominant issue, which I think it is, what's the polarized thing on that? So I think the complexity of these ideas. Also, you notice the fluidity, not to make this all about Donald Trump, but Donald Trump changes his ideas a lot. And you see a lot of politicians being quite fluid in what they believe. So I think the future is much more fluid, much more fragmentary. I think polarization was an initial attempt to deal with a really complex world. So here's a bucket. Here's something new. Oh, where do I put this movie or this new thing? Oh, is it left or right? Oh, it's right. And then I don't have to think about it. I think the scale of complexity coming is going to mean that's going to break down.
Yeah. Mark, any final comments? We sort of, people have been listening to us and maybe that was a little bit of a taking in a fire hydrant of thoughts and ideas from you two. Thanks so much. But I've got lots to think about, whether it's how do I live in AI, the future, and what that might be, how I live out my faith, whatever it might be. What would be your encouragement to somebody who's listening and saying, well, you know what, I want to live a life that is actually the truest to who I am and to what God has for me, and is actually making real difference in this world. What would be your encouragement to someone?
Yeah, I think often people will say of me, which is that you the first part of your sort of presentations are really depressing, but then the second part is super hopeful. So I track these trends, some of which are challenging and concerning, and I'm concerned and challenged by them. But all it does is it elevates my hope. Because at the end of the day, what the scriptures tell me is that a hope cannot be put in the world. It cannot be put in that which is not eternal. It can't be put in the rules of this world, the ideologies of this world, the inventions of this world. All of my hope is in Jesus Christ. And what I've seen in my life, I'll go back to that story we sort of began with earlier. When I was 16, I reached an absolute crisis where, I had a mental health challenge. I didn't want to go on, really. And, I look at what God's done in my life. I've had sufferings, I've had difficulties. My wife's just gone through a cancer journey. But in all of that, I've seen the slow work of Jesus. Every time I've been overwhelmed, confused, and said, I'm at the end of myself, Jesus, please take the steering wheel. As I've done that, I've seen God grow me, my family, Trudy, my wife, my church. I've seen my friends' lives change. That this stuff isn't just an idea, it really changes people. And to just say to Jesus that simple statement, take the steering wheel. And you may not even know what that means, but get around people who do this in community. For me, that is just one of the most profoundly hopeful things that I've done. And I am, in a darkened world, the light gets brighter, and the light of Jesus gives me incredible hope.
Yeah. Mark, the program's called Towards Understanding, helping us head towards more understanding. You've certainly done that for us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
My guest, Mark Sayers, here on Towards Understanding.
Hi, it's Melissa Doyle for World Vision. Christmas is the perfect time to give kindness to a child in need. Each child I've sponsored with World Vision holds a special place in my heart. I'll never forget meeting 4-year-old Bridget in Kenya. Her mum just wanted to send her to school. That dream came true thanks to sponsorship. This Christmas, you too can help a child gain hope and essentials like food, clean water and education. Search World Vision and sponsor a child today.